Hello, everybody, and welcome to May's webinar for the Phia Group, Empowering Your Plan Since the Year 2000. This is your host, Adam Russo. I am bunkered and down in my basement again. This is week 10 of our, whatever you want to call this, not seeing other people, not hugging, not shaking hands, not doing any high fives, nothing. So as I predicted months ago, we will be the last state to reopen. There's no question here in Massachusetts. We got our 4-part plan, I believe, yesterday. So we're looking at probably being able to see other people sometime by August. Let's see what happens. Anyways, folks, Matt, let's get to the next slide, bud. What is today's topic? A pandemic economy, industry risk and opportunities. We're going to talk about a bunch of stuff. You guys will see there's a whole bunch of things we need to cover. So we're going to try to make this quick for this hour-long session. Matt, next slide. Okay, Matt, next slide, buddy. Oh, man, we're having some problems already. Perfect, thank you. So to stay ahead of what's going on in the industry, stay ahead of this COVID-19, please contact that pgcreferral@fiagroup.com with any questions. We've done so many, almost 1,000, I think, projects as it relates to this. We're obviously here to help you. We're here to help the industry, here to help our clients and potential prospects as well. Matt, next slide. Okay, what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about PGC's FAQs. I think you all know who's going to cover that. We're going to talk about the future of health plans, the political update, navigating layoffs, furloughs, and reduction in hours. Lots of questions as it relates to that. We will discuss the HEROES Act and SIA's letter to Congress, as well as the extension of deadlines, the occupational COVID-19 and other workers' compensation considerations. There's a lot to cover there. That could be its own session. And last but not least, probably one of the things I think is most important is our actual Phia COVID-19 response plan. Folks, it is detailed. It covers everything. We're going to talk about that. And obviously, we can help any of you out there as it relates to your response plan too. So next slide, Matt. Here are today's speakers. There is me. I will and am wearing that exact suit right now. Just no pants, no socks, no shoes. In addition, with me, as always, is our Executive VP and General Counsel, Ron E. Peck. Say hello, Ron.
Hello, Ron. Do I really need to say hello, Ron? I feel like I'm the only one talking to myself lately these days. All right. Hello, Ron, again.
You have to keep saying it, buddy. I'm sorry. Folks, the attendance today is insane. Wow, very impressive. As always, the amazing, the wonderful, the reason all you dial in, Jennifer M. McCormick. Say hello, Jennifer.
Hello.
Not bad, Jen. No delay there. Pretty impressive. And as always, even though you know none of us want him here, he's here. He's done an amazing job on our response plan. I have to give him credit for that. And I'm sure he's going to talk politics. We'll just try to cut him down, cut him short. We'll just try to cut him off in any way possible. The only problem is I can't reach across, just grab him. And I'm sure he is wearing that beautiful, old, weathered, dirty, disgusting Phia fleece. The Director of Legal Compliance and Regulatory Affairs here at the Phia Group. Say hello to Brady C. Bizzarro. Say hello, Brady.
Hello, Brady.
Not bad, not bad. A little bit of a delay. Jen did the best, but not so bad. All right, Matt, let's get to that next slide, bud. Folks, as always, please follow us on LinkedIn. You can go right to fiagroup.com, Phia Group LLC, to search for us, find us. There are thousands of people that do it. Great information, great insight, always first to the industry with all the news. In addition, next slide. We've had some really cool podcasts recently. Go on to our Phia Group website under media, podcasts, and listen to any of them. You can find out when we're going to have the next ones as well. Let's go to that next slide, bud. As always, we have our special shout out and thank you for listening to Elaine Holzhauer, the program manager at Berkeley Accident and Health. They're our great friends over there at Berkeley. And what did Elaine tell us? She said a fun fact. I speak 4 languages, have traveled through all parts of Europe on river cruises, and I lived in another country for a short period of time. Pretty awesome. Can't complain. I speak 2 languages, as you all know. She speaks 4. Be interested in finding out which 4 languages she actually speaks. I wonder how many more river cruises she'll be having in upcoming years. We'll see about that.
I'm glad she got her travel in while she could, Adam.
That is true. That is true. And she got to live in another country too, Ron, which is also good. Okay, next slide. This is what I'm very excited about. Yes, that is me. Yes, I am on a crane. Yes, I am at the top of our building. Yes, I am right next to my sign. I cried like crazy. My kids were all watching me go up there. I think my wife was hoping that I would fall off. She can collect that insurance proceeds. This is our new address, our new building at 40 Pequot Way in Canton, Massachusetts. I was there this morning. My office is completely set up. I had social distancing of about 650 feet, I would guess, at least. And I can tell you, we're just pumped about it. It's a beautiful building. We are having a staggered approach to bringing people back in. We have a skeleton crew of roughly 15 people there currently, and we're hoping to get to about 80 people in the next coming weeks. We'll see about that, but it's exciting. It's a whole new beginning for Phia, and I want to thank all the people out there who've reached out to us and just congratulated us on what we've been able to accomplish over the past 20 years. With that, I'm going to turn it over to the person that all of you want to hear from, and that is the lovely Jen McCormick. Jen, take it away with the most frequently asked questions. Jen?
All right, thank you. So I'm sure that it is no surprise to everyone that we are still getting a ton of questions about COVID and FFCRA and CARES and what the obligations are. And now we're starting to get some questions about how long do I have to do this? What exactly do I need to do? So FAQ number 1. So under the Act, can we impose any limitations on COVID-19 testing? So whether we can say 1 per person, whether we can require or not require asymptomatic individuals to get treated or tested. Well, looking from the particular FAQs that came along with the regulations, there's something that's particularly telling. And in those FAQs, particularly we referenced number 6 here, there is something about whether a plan can impose any sort of requirements, prior auth requirements, or medical management requirements for benefits under the regulations. And the answer to that is no, that there is not allowed to be permitted any sort of cost-sharing requirements, a deductible, copay, coinsurance, or medical management techniques, which broadly interpreted would mean that you cannot put anything that would be disparate from what was required by the attending healthcare provider. So if there is a physician that says that it's medically appropriate or medically necessary for an individual to be tested more than once, or if they're asymptomatic, then you cannot impose any limitations on that. So it's our interpretation to err on the side of coverage when it comes to this testing. All right, next question. All right, so we have yet to know the actual end date for this national emergency, unfortunately, but we still know that we have to make some modifications to our plan language so we can account for this diagnostic testing, some of these leaves, and potentially the extension of deadlines that Brady's going to talk about in a little bit. So what do we put in our plan document? So since there's not a specific date, that means that we're going to instead want to use events because we know what the events are. Specifically, we're talking about the outbreak period, and that's the terminology we should be using within our plan document. And we know that the outbreak period is that time frame from March 1st, 2020 until 60 days after the end of the COVID-19 national emergency, or is otherwise declared. So that's the time frame that you should be using when you're looking to make modifications to your plan document, and that remains a recommendation. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ron.
Thanks, Jen. So a lot of us are talking about what do we need to do now, but yes, there are a few who are even asking what are we going to do tomorrow, and really what the impact of this pandemic is going to have on health benefits in general and health plans in general. And you might remember during our previous webinar last month, and if you haven't heard it, go to the website, reach out, listen to a recorded copy of that webinar. We did talk about the outcry against the concept of health insurance being tethered to employment. This being a result of the increased unemployment numbers, people saying, well, if people don't have jobs, they don't have health insurance. A couple things that they did miss and that we talked about during the prior webinar is if people don't have jobs and they're not making income, then they really don't have anything with which to purchase insurance, regardless of whether it's attached to employment or uncoupled from employment. So that's one issue. There was definitely a bit of a Medicare for All agenda sort of underlying the arguments. And again, be sure to listen to our last webinar. But let's say that you're somebody who accepts that, you know what, employment-based health insurance isn't going anywhere. Is it going to change? And so the general consensus right now amongst the talking heads is, yes, it's going to change. There's going to be less dependency on traditional PPO plans. You're going to start seeing more cost shifting onto the consumer in the form of high deductible plans, which, as you know, we at the Phia Group, and especially Adam, has railed against repeatedly as sort of a lazy option, that there are better ways to contain costs. And that attitude or that philosophy that we've shared in the past really comes up again here, which is that if cost containment is going to be sort of the theme of health plans in the days to come, you're going to have to ask, do I just increase deductibles or do I identify other ways to contain costs? And I think the general consensus amongst us industry members is that one of the hurdles that we've had in the past to implementing new cost containment programs or measures and sort of abandoning traditional network plans has been, like it or not, that it's difficult to communicate this to the employees, to the plan participants themselves, to educate them. And I think that, and we think that this pandemic may be the kick in the pants that employees need to listen up. Because in the past, they may have protested these types of innovative changes, but now I think everyone is going to accept that change is inevitable. This is something unheard of, and is something that I think, again, is a trigger point or opportunity to educate employees, understanding that they're anticipating high costs. Yeah.
Well, we're already seeing a change in the mindset of employees, brokers as well.
Oh, yeah.
As it relates to offering and the ability to have new designs, new innovation when it comes to plan design. Because again, I think most people understand that employers can't overspend, right? They understand that there's a lot of tightening of the belts, and there are new opportunities where you could have higher quality, lower costs in different methodologies. So if there's any time to try it, it's probably now. We've seen that just based on our plan design changes that we've seen clients request. So I agree with your point right there.
Great point. Matt, next slide. Adam, it's almost like you knew what the next slide was going to be. Imagine that.
I did not. I did not.
Can you believe it, right? No, but I think that we're right when we say that it's all about assumption, right? Plan participants, employees, their families, the people who are on the plan. If you think about it, what drives how we provide benefits has always been driven by the assumptions on the part of those employees. Up until recently, the assumption on the part of employees, plan participants is, I assume you're going to cover this. I assume you're going to include that provider in my network. I assume everything is going to be provided for free or low cost. So that when you do things that bump up against those assumptions, you look like the bad guy. But now, if you're listening to what these people are saying, just in general, media, employees, plan participants, to your point, brokers, employers, the assumption is, I assume I can't afford health benefits. I assume I'm going to have to increase deductibles. So while negative verbiage and negative tone, the fact of the matter is this is an opportunity to take those assumptions and say, that's not necessarily true. If we reduce the size of the network, if we engage in an alternative pricing methodology, if we implement these new measures that in the past the time wasn't right, now is the time. And you can actually say, yes, you can continue offering these benefits. And I think that works to our favor.
A good example of that, Ron, is telemedicine. I mean, let's say, a few months back, any employee or any employee that was against it or pushing back on it, well, I would think going forward, people either A, already have access to it, already been using it over the past few months, so be much more open to having telemedicine, video conferences with their doctors, direct primary care, et cetera. Those options are going to be much more welcome today and in the future than they were even a few months ago.
Great examples. Necessity is the mother of invention, and I think that we're realizing that today. So speaking of things that are necessary, let's go ahead and move on to the political update. And Brady, hey Brady, before you go, I do want to ask you a question.
Sure.
Are you ready? Okay. If the
I'm ready.
opposite of pro is con, what's the opposite of progress?
That's a good
Funny.
question. I don't. It's funny. I'll
Congress.
tell you. Congress. Okay, I knew that was coming. That's
Brady,
a great joke, Ryan.
are you wearing the fleece, Brady?
I'm not wearing the fleece. It's warm weather out finally. I'm not wearing the fleece, Adam. I promise you.
Put on the fleece. You won't do a good of a job, trust me. And try to keep this
But
quick.
I
We know you like to ramble.
I may not have that on, but I do have on, of course, C-SPAN. But in all seriousness, for this political update, if you ever needed a sign of the times that we're living in, you had here on May 4th, for the first time in the history of the Supreme Court, a live oral argument, which was amazing to dial into and hear. If you want some comic relief, by the way, for those listening, you can look up a news story about how someone flushed a toilet during the Supreme Court oral arguments. Unbelievable story. Whoever that was, pretty insane. But let's go to the next slide, Matt, because in the Supreme Court, there are some big cases going on, as always happens in the summertime. And this time we're talking once again about Obamacare. So on the next slide, we can look at some of the cases that are percolating in the Supreme Court. So Matt, let's go ahead and move a slide.
Hey, when it comes to Obama, I have just a quick story, if you guys don't mind. So my daughter, my oldest daughter's in first grade, and they have to do a project on a president. They can pick any president they want. So there are 22 kids in her classroom. So she comes to me and says, I'm going to write mine on President Barack Obama. I go, listen, Sully, every single kid in your class is going to write about Obama. Why don't you pick any other president? I'm just going down the list. I'm like Buchanan, Lincoln, anybody, Garfield, Cleveland, whoever. But nope, she went with Obama. And folks, guess what? 22 out of 22 kids all chose Obama for their book report. So I thought it was interesting.
So I'm glad I can always use this picture of President Obama because it shows him sort of breaking out a sweat. And every time the ACA finds itself in court, I think that's how really the entire healthcare industry should feel, because we still don't have an answer to what's going to happen with the ACA in general. But I want to mention three cases that are very important and I want to save some time for. The first of them is a ruling came down here on the risk corridors case. Now, if you're asking what are the risk corridors, what does that even mean? I forgot what that's about. Remember that when the ACA passed, there were the 3 R's, which were programs that were put in place by Congress to help stabilize premium rates, because they knew, Congress knew that by asking insurance companies to cover very sick people, it'd be very expensive. And so one of the 3 R's was the risk corridor program, which under which Congress would reimburse insurance companies that spent a lot of money on high-risk people. So it turns out from 2014 to 2016, the losses far exceeded the money that came in to the tune of $12 billion. So the federal government owed large insurance companies $12 billion. In fact, it was more than just large insurance companies. You had dozens of cases, up to 161 different insurance companies were suing the federal government because the federal government decided it wasn't going to pay that $12 billion. So this case here was basically about whether the government would honor its obligations that it had made to these insurance companies who, again, agreed to take on sick people, high-risk people, in exchange for a temporary subsidy of their losses. So the point in this case here is that the justices ruled 8-1, pretty resoundingly, that the government has to honor its debts and its obligations, and that insurance companies were due this money. So what does that mean for us in the industry? Well, it's not going to impact directly self-funded employers or the industry, but it will more broadly impact the entire health insurance marketplace, because it's going to help provide that money to stabilize premium rates for next year. And as Ron will talk about in a few slides down the road on the HEROES Act, there is a new version of the Risk Corridors program that's been introduced in language for self-funded plans. So we'll watch and see, but the takeaway here is that the government tried to get away with not paying the money it owed, and it had to pay. That's a good thing. The second case here is an update on the contraceptive mandate case. This was a case I mentioned that was heard in oral argument. We've been following it for a while, and we've given previously a long history over it. I'll just give you a very, very quick summary of what's going on here. Remember that the Trump administration passed rules here that it broadened the exemptions to the contraceptive mandate, basically allowing employers that had a religious or a moral objection to exempt themselves from having to provide contraceptive coverage. So previously, you could request an accommodation if you qualified for one, and then your TPA would have to pay for contraceptive coverage. In this case, though, with the Trump rules, you could switch that accommodation over to an exemption, and you wouldn't have to provide the coverage, and neither would your TPA. So of course, a lower court found those rules to be too excessive, and this petitioner here, Little Sisters of the Poor, sued. And what's going to happen here, my take on this is you have three camps of justice fell in. Some said that the rules went too far. Some said that the government could have an expanded exemption, but that this exemption wasn't done properly, not under the procedure. And then you have those that agree with the Trump administration. So what I think is going to happen here, because you have this last bullet point on the last case, I think they're going to punt on this case. And by that, I mean, I think they're going to kick this case back down to the lower court for more analysis, or they could kick this case back down to the agency to rewrite the rules. And the reason is because why would they rule on a case as important as this when they're actually considering the biggest case of them all, which is California v. Texas, formerly the Texas versus United States case. And the note there is that the briefs were due on May 6th. They've been submitted. The oral arguments in this case, and this case is about whether the entire ACA is unconstitutional now that we have an individual mandate with no penalty, right? That's the one we've been following for all this time. And finally, it's made its way to the Supreme Court. So it won't be heard this session, which ends in June. But the next term, which starts in October, is when you'll hear oral arguments, and we'll have a decision in 2021. So the signals there is that they're considering the full scope of that case. So it's going to be a blockbuster case next year where it's probably going to be as big as the original ACA case way back in 2010. So I'll be excited for that if we're all still around by then. But for now, that's your update on what's going on with Obamacare and the Supreme Court. A lot going on. We'll keep watching and see where this goes. But we want to move on here to talk about furloughs, layoffs, reduction in hours, because after all, this is a pandemic economy that we're talking about. And there's significant impacts both in coverage of what you have to offer under your plan and how you have to respond and behave as an employer. And we've got all the bases covered, starting with, of course, what you've got to do to your plan document, to your employer leave policies to make sure that you're offering first the coverage that you have to, and then also continuing coverage when you may want to and you may not have to. So the first thing to understand here is that there's a difference between a furlough and a leave of absence, although there's no universal definition. Typically what we're talking about when we're talking about furlough is a temporary separation from employment. You're still keeping people on the payroll. It's an unpaid leave of absence, particularly. By contrast, the layoff is where you're pretty much telling people that, we're not sure we'll bring you back. You're separating them from the payroll. It's also unpaid, but there's no real intention to bring them back. The commonality, though, is that both of these represent an unpaid leave of absence. And whether or not you want to continue coverage for your employees that you may have to furlough or lay off is going to be up to you. But if you decide that you do want to cover them under your health plan and continue coverage, you've got to make sure that you have language in your documents to make sure you can do that, because otherwise you're risking stop loss, not reimbursing claims that are incurred by people who should not be eligible. And if they're not eligible, by the way, they would have a COBRA qualifying event. So you want to look at your documents now, make sure you have the proper language, make sure you're specifying a duration for that coverage. So if you're going to lay people off or furlough them, if you know how long you want to continue their coverage, put that in your document, because otherwise you have an open-ended coverage duration, and that can cause problems as well. So a plan modification may be required. Again, there's a lot of stop-loss carriers out there now that are accepting sort of an email or not an official plan amendment. If you talk with them, they understand that right now things are a bit crazy. But the goal here is to definitely eventually try to get something in writing in the form of a plan amendment to make sure that you have these well-defined parameters. Yes.
We talked about this in last month's webinar in detail. So folks, feel free to go on our website and look it up on last month's webinar. And as things change, obviously we'll update you. But again, feel free to just email us at PGC Referral if you have any unique, specific questions that we didn't answer.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So let's go to the next slide, Matt, and we can talk about a few other quick points on this topic here. So again, a reduction in hours. Remember that in your plan document, you should already have a minimum hour requirement for eligibility for coverage. So if you're going to be reducing hours for employees that are on your plan, then obviously that's going to impact their eligibility under the plan. If you say you've got to work 30 hours and you're asking people only to work 20 or 15, then that's where you're going to need to modify the language to make sure that you have a way to cover them if you want to continue their coverage. But you should not just be keeping them on the plan without modifying the language, because again, then they're technically not eligible. I talked about how the COBRA issue there. Again, this will come up again under the HEROES Act when Ron talks about it, because there's a potential for the government to subsidize the cost of COBRA entirely, which would be a great thing. But we're watching that to see. But look at the impact that this may have if you modify your plan language. Make sure that you're not violating, for example, the employer mandate. So the reason that could come up would be if you're furloughing employees that are otherwise full-time, right? You've got to still make sure that you're offering minimum essential coverage to at least 95% of your workforce. So that's why you've got to make sure the plan language matches what you're doing in terms of eligibility, because there's a lot of downstream trickle-down effects. And like Adam said, we have a lot more detail on this. If you want to contact us, look at our other webinar. We've covered this extensively, and we're going to cover it a bit more with Jen McCormick on the next slide.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you very much. All right, Matt, you want to switch it to the next? There we go. All right. So in addition to talking about layoffs or furloughs, another common question that we're getting is, well, how can I modify my actively at work provision within my plan document? I want to make sure that I can account for the particular business concerns that I have. I don't want to offer a layoff. I just want to make sure that I can modify this provision so I'm not going to put people at risk, making people ineligible or people that shouldn't have been eligible in the first place eligible. So whatever it is that you decide to do and however you modify the language, just make sure that your policies, not only the stop loss policies, but any handbook policies you had, are also sort of in line with what those changes are. We're commonly getting a lot of questions about how that language, if you're modifying the AAW or the actively at work provision, what that would look like. So just a couple of examples are down here too if you wanted to jot these down, or you can always ask us questions later on if this is something that you're interested in doing. But this is particularly important right now as we're talking about our return to work policies and making sure that we might need to modify these or change these around if maybe we're starting to bring our workforce back to the actual office. All right, Matt, next slide. Okay. So just some considerations too. We're actually making these modifications to the plan. Recently, we talked about how there were some extensions, and Brady's going to go into some more detail about that. But there are requirements that we have to have this language within our plan to make sure that everyone realizes that that testing is going to be covered. And when we are outlining the plan document language, we need to make sure that this testing or the treatment or whatever modifications that you're making is being treated the same as any other illness. So there shouldn't be any sort of extra conditions, pre-auth requirements, as we discussed, that apply to COVID-19 testing that don't otherwise apply to any other benefits that are in the plan. And the other thing to keep in mind too is as you're actually adding in this language into the document, is there anything that would outline some sort of conflict or gap by making these modifications? If you are extending coverage for treatment, but you want to cover it at 100%, would that create some sort of issue with a network agreement or some other vendor relationship that you have? So making sure that that's not going to create any problems. So whatever it is that you're actually putting in your plan, clearly define what those parameters are and make sure that you are defining how long that coverage should continue. And if you're modifying that actively at work definition and you're looking now to say, I want to start bringing back 25% of my workforce, is your continuation of coverage language allow you to do that? Does that layoff language allow you to do that? And make sure it's not only in the plan, but like I said before, those employment policies as well. All right, let's go to the next slide, Matt. Okay, timing. So some good news here, something that we should all be excited about. So there is a non-enforcement provision action that's being taken right now. So if you are making these changes to your plan, it is okay if you don't necessarily do it immediately and it's not immediately there. It's always our recommendation that you do it as quickly as possible. But the good news is no action, no penalties, nothing is going to be counted against you if that is not done as soon as you possibly can, like tomorrow. And that's going to be the position that the agencies will be taking until the end of this public health emergency. However, that's not a guarantee that that's not going to create any gaps with underlying agreements or policies that you might have in place. And also, if this is something that you might be looking to take advantage of, maybe keeping that furlough or layoff provisions in place in the plan, if you want to do that beyond this period, then you should make sure that you absolutely modify your plan to account for that. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that documents aren't the only thing that need to be modified. Our SBCs need to be changed too. So anything that you're making a modification to, everything should match. Because the last thing that you want to do is create a change in one document that's not being carried over to another document. All right, I'll turn it back over to you, Ron, talk about the HEROES Act.
Great. Can't talk about heroes without having me involved, huh? So, for anyone, especially Brady, but really anybody who's been following the developments on Capitol Hill.
Ron,
oh, yep. What's up, Adam?
Are those people 6 feet apart?
You know what, Adam? I actually think that those
tight.
people were photoshopped. They're photoshopped into the picture because I don't think they sell masks that big either. So something seems off about it. But it's all about perception.
Some of the masks are covering people's eyes. Pretty wild.
You don't have to see it if you're not going to read it. No, but jokes aside, and it's actually a good lead-in. There's been a lot of talk and movement on Capitol Hill as well as at the state level as we look at different proposals to help ease the burden both on employers and health benefit plans and providers, all arising from this current situation. And again, one of the more recent proposals, the HEROES Act, is actually, I think it's stimulus number 4. And again, Matt, if we want to move on to the next slide, we can get into some of the meat. But basically, this is was a House proposal that was passed by the House, and I think that was on May 15th. And again, the House was very much in support of the content. It had gone through a number of different versions. But when it got to the Senate, there were many different issues that they had with it. So the version that was passed by the House and presented to the Senate, do not assume that it's going to be passed. It almost certainly will not. And it's going to have to go through some more changes, things like oversight and funding and payroll taxes, and you could see the bullet there. So too many issues to really talk about here. But what I think is important is to actually talk about some of the proposals in the Act that reflect a philosophy on the part of the federal government and what that philosophy is going to mean for our industry, because it's going to power proposals, not just this version, but future bills that actually will be passed. It's going to keep coming up, right? So what are they targeting? What are they looking at as potential issues or areas for improvement when it comes to the types of costs that we as an industry are dealing with? And I am proud to say that SIA and the Government Relations Committee, with which I'm honored to be a part, have been providing oversight, providing feedback. I'm actually very impressed by the response that we're getting, and I think it really goes to show that the relationships that we've built in the past are now bearing fruit. Some of the issues that had come up, or some of the ideas that had come up in prior versions, included COBRA subsidies. This is a big one, right? Because I had mentioned previously, one of the big issues that you're starting to hear about is, well, as people are losing their jobs, they're losing their coverage. Well, they can get coverage through COBRA, but can they afford COBRA? Boom, COBRA subsidies is one proposed solution. But of course, we wanted to emphasize the need that COBRA subsidies should not be isolated or specifically just for traditional fully funded insurance, but rather should also apply to employees and plan members who lose coverage from their self-funded plan when they lose employment. And again, that was picked up. So now sort of being included in that handout, the COBRA subsidies, that self-funded plans are not going to be disadvantaged compared to traditional fully funded insurance. Likewise, the idea that COVID treatment, and you've been hearing this since day one, right? Testing, treatment needs to be covered in full, right? Pumping the brakes a little and saying, look, we all agree that these plans need to be amended, that these tests and treatment need to be covered. Yes, indeed. But let's not lose sight of the other protective restrictions you see in your benefit plan, things like medical necessity, right? So even though somebody is going and being tested every single week, despite the fact that they have no symptoms and haven't encountered anybody, are the tests covered? Yes. Would they be covered in that situation? No. So again, being able to still apply limitations like medical necessity is going to be important. Another thing, and this is fascinating because this COVID-19 pandemic and the governmental response, the legal response to it, is almost like a microcosm or a small example, a petri dish, to see the philosophy in general of lawmakers regarding healthcare overall. And one of those big nagging issues that has been debated in the Capitol buildings, both at the state and national level, prior to this pandemic, but now as part of it, is this issue of surprise billing and balance bills. And this idea that a regulation needs to be put in place, a law needs to be presented that would limit or eliminate balance billing, surprise billing is how they're referring to it, specifically arising from or related to COVID-19 and the treatment and care for that. But the reason this is so important is because whatever method that they end up selecting or choosing to address surprise balance bills for COVID may lay the foundation or be a blueprint that is later used to deal with surprise balance billing in general. So we need to be sure that whatever methodology they choose to address surprise balance billing for COVID is something with which we'd be willing to live at a bigger, higher, greater level at some point down the line. So this is just sort of the gateway drug.
One more thing to discuss, folks, as we've noticed with our claim negotiation area, more and more hospitals, as you can imagine, have more layoffs. They're obviously not scheduling surgeries or just beginning to now. Electives, we're still seeing, at least in the Massachusetts area, a very small percentage of people going into emergency rooms for non-COVID related treatment. So if there was ever a time to utilize this moment for negotiation, direct contracting, getting those outstanding balance bills resolved, this is the time. We're seeing much more, a bigger ability for our staff, our team, our specialists to get deals done than ever before. So just want to remind you folks that if you have those claims sitting out there, now is probably the best time to get them.
Couldn't agree with you more. And, you know, there are other things that are coming through sort of down the pike with the HEROES Act and other proposals following it. I'm sure number 4 is not going to be the last one. But that being said, you know, as we're hearing about these new things, we'll be letting you know that different organizations that represent our industry are fighting on your behalf. And as these new ideas and proposals are thrown out there, you'll be the first to know. But it's fascinating stuff, everybody, because for every lawmaker who's had an idea stewing in the back of their head as to how to solve the healthcare issue in general, this is the trial run. This is the draft. So speaking of trials and drafts, let's go to the guinea pig of the company, Brady Bizzarro.
That's a great transition, Ron. I appreciate that. So look, when we talk about extensions of deadlines, before I get into this, I want to mention one last thing on the HEROES Act. Like Ron said, this is not going to be the last version of this bill. I think already the Senate's working on a comparative version. The good thing to note, though, is a lot of the popular provisions do tend to make it into the other versions. So like the COBRA subsidy tends to have bipartisan support. So that'll be a great thing for our industry, and we expect that to be left in. But like Ron said, we'll keep watching it. One thing that has happened, though, was, and we knew this was coming, but really when it came out, the impact is pretty serious, right? An extension of deadlines related to all things plan document related. So on May 4th, Department of Labor and Treasury extended several deadlines, including those related to COBRA. So basically the period running from March 1st, 2020 through 60 days after the end of the federal COVID-19 emergency period, which again, we don't know when that's going to end. So it's kind of an unknown period, but you've got to disregard that period entirely for purposes of determining various deadlines. So, for example, the 180-day appeal window where you have to decide on an appeal, that has to be discounted. Those days won't count in that 180 days. So we're talking about a serious extension for some of these deadlines. Look at the list here, right? It's impacting HIPAA, special enrollment periods, COBRA election deadline, the premium payment extension, claim filing. So, you know, request for external review. This is really significantly delaying things. So the first thing you should be thinking of is, okay, who do I have to notify? One answer is the plan participants, but note here that the departments have said that you as a plan will not be penalized if you comply with the requirements without corresponding plan language. So they understand that, you know, they just sort of sprung this on us all at once, and that you might not have the time right now to be managing, you know, plan language. Hopefully you do. And in fact, we recommend you do. both to advise members of their rights and to make sure that you don't have any stop-loss reimbursement issues, because again, while these requirements and extensions apply directly to you via federal law, they do not apply to stop-loss. So, and also again, most carriers will understand that and they'll work with you. But if you have questions about the extension here and you need sample language about what should be in the amendment to your plan, reach out to us. We have sample language and we have more answers to those questions, and we're happy to provide them. Let's go to the next slide. Just a few other notes here on what this means in terms of the impact. So the IRS, of course, will have to allow mid-year health plan changes, because you have to, if you do want to amend your plan to reflect the extension of the deadlines, you will not be penalized for doing so. And then some optional changes, including, if you want to enroll or drop coverage, you can do that. If you want to make a change to your FSA contributions, you can do that. You can increase the carryover limits by $50, which you might want to do. And then any grace period extension to use in the 2019 carryover will be allowed. But the main ones were the things we discussed on the previous slides, especially with respect to claim filing and the appeal window. That's going to be very important, and it's going to drag things out, and it will have an impact. There could be run-in issues, run-out issues. So you want to make sure that you're really understanding how that'll impact your plan, contacting the relevant players, including stop-loss, and reaching out to us if you need, like I said, the plan language, a sample of what it should look like, or any other more in-depth questions you may have about that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jen to talk about some workers' compensation issues, which we've seen a ton of questions about, and we'll dig in a bit here.
Awesome. All right. Thank you. Occupational COVID-19. This is a huge topic. And I had mentioned a little bit earlier, as everyone is starting to get the workforce back in the office, we're starting to see what our protocols look like for how this is being handled and what the new normal is starting to look like. So as we're starting to have people back in the office, that's going to increase the possibility that there could be some work-related claims that arise that are specific to COVID-19. And this is particularly for those that are considered to be essential workers. So I don't know if Adam or Ron want to announce any other news about that, but just we're going to talk at a high level about some of these considerations now. And if you have other questions in more detail, hopefully we'll be able to address those at a later time. So there are different considerations when we're talking about a workers' compensation claim, particularly for COVID. So for the employer, this is something that we've dealt with here for Phia as well. We want to make sure that any recommendations that are issued by the CDC or the WHO, and I'm not going to talk about the specifics that are going on right now, I'll leave that up to Brady, but we want to make sure that we are following those recommendations and guidelines, that we are doing all that we can to make sure that there is a plan in place for anyone who's coming back to the office, that they know what their protocol is right now for working at home, and they know what to expect when they return to the office and what we expect of them when they're going to be in the office as well. As far as the workers' compensation consideration, there should be some higher frequency claims that we are starting to see in some industries. Maybe not those industries that are necessarily working from home, but maybe in the healthcare field, or in the fields where there's manufacturing, or people in the delivery services, or those that are considered to be essential. And overall, you can expect likely to see some higher claim costs when it comes to those particular treatments. And this is going to create an administrative burden not only on the system, but also on the employer as well, to try to manage all of these. And from the employee's perspective, whether or not getting that positive test when they test positive for COVID-19, does that mean that there's going to be a presumption that they're going to get workers' compensation or disability? Well, that's going to depend on the particular facts and circumstances, and even the jurisdiction where the individual is located. And for the plan, we talked about some of these, making the modifications to the plan document, communicating with our team, communicating with stop loss, and making sure we're communicating with all those other vendors that might be around. So what in the world is occupational COVID-19? So everyone at this point should hopefully know what it is that is considered a work-related injury. That's something that's going to arise out of or within the scope of employment. But when we're talking about occupational COVID, that's specifically when that injury that arose out of the scope of employment has something to do specifically with contracting, or there was some contributing factor to actually getting COVID-19. And we can realize and consider how easy it is that there are people that are in a higher risk industry, like those first responders or those that are delivering services or those that are working for the airlines or transportation that are actually going to be at a higher risk of getting exposed than others. So with that, is there going to be a potential presumption that they would be getting workers' compensation? Well, and the answer to that is really going to depend on the different states, because different states have different analysis about who's going to be considered essential and whether or not there's going to be a presumption. And some of those states, Illinois was one of them, they had a very loose definition of who was considered essential, including within that definition, funeral directors and delivery drivers and people that worked at gas stations. So that rule has actually been withdrawn, but it's really something to pay attention to because all these states are coming out with different rules about what it is that would be considered to be falling within the workers' compensation analysis. All right, next slide, Matt. Next slide, Matt. Perfect. Okay. All right. So the next thing that we need to do here is to figure out, should there be a positive test that an individual has for COVID-19? What do we do? How do we connect it? How do we decide whether or not this is actually a workers' compensation issue? This is hard. This is going to be a hard analysis for everyone to figure out. But we do know right now that OSHA has declared this to be a recordable event. So if there is somebody who is going to be testing positive at work for having COVID-19, this has to be reported to federal agencies. So there are certain things that we need to do. Maybe this should be part of our protocols, and Brady's going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But how do we make those connections? How do we determine whether or not the actual virus was a contributing factor and whether or not this person, this individual, wasn't otherwise exposed when they were at Walmart or the grocery store or some other public setting? You have to create a timeliness analysis too. So there's some certain questions that you have to look at on a case-by-case basis for that actual individual case. Some considerations would be, is it required for that individual to travel? Does that individual are they required to travel to locations that are known to have a higher risk or threat or exposure to COVID-19? Was that worker engaging with people who may have or are known to have contracted COVID-19? The process for examining how these claims should be handled should be no different than any other workers' compensation claim, but just making sure there is that traceability and these are being handled on a case-by-case basis, mindful of the particular laws within that jurisdiction. Next slide, Matt. All right, next we're going to talk about, as soon as we get to this next slide here, some of the consequences. There are certain things that we need to consider when it comes to the consequences for our health perspective. So COVID-19 is still pretty new here. And when it comes to what it is that's required or how somebody could recover or how they might not recover, we don't know. There is a possibility that someone could have a permanent disability. Maybe that would mean they'd be eligible for permanent disability benefits. We just don't know at this point. And what happens if somebody is exposed, but they're not necessarily symptomatic? Is the employer going to be required or responsible for offering a temporary disability during that time frame? And what about our employees that are working from home? Is there something that we should be worried about for them? Because there's a possibility that even if they're working from home, that they are doing and acting within the scope of their work, but they actually are getting some other issues or they're incurring some sort of claims. We'll expect to see some of these types of claims. Like I said, overall, the frequency is going to be lower with less people actually working, but that's not necessarily going to be the case all over. And the other consideration here, too, for these increased potential frequency of claims is that as we're hiring new people, maybe we're hiring and training in a way that we've never had to deal with before. And maybe that not having that face-to-face training is putting us in a situation where we're not able to actually train as thoroughly as we otherwise would have, and that's creating an opportunity for more accidents and injuries to occur. So we should just be aware of that, and particularly if you're in industries where the workers are considered to be essential, are there protocols that are in place to do the best that we can to protect them from being exposed and having the protocols that will protect us should there be an incident that arises? And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Brady.
All right, thank you, Jen. So we can get the next slide here on the impact of workers' compensation workers' compensation carriers here. The cost impact will be pretty extreme, and I think this is a fitting picture here of our our very own Ben Franklin with a mask on. But look, if you're going to see a spike in claims to workers' compensation carriers, then there's going to be an impact to them, and then that would presumably increase your workers' compensation rates, right? So some impacts that we've seen, and this varies by state as well. So from New York, from late March, of $31 billion, that's more than triple the state's current annual losses in both the insured and the self-funded markets. But we expect every other state to have a similar impact here. And workers' compensation was not designed originally as intended to cover communicable diseases and not those associated with a global pandemic. And in this case, as you have states coming out with a sort of different strategy state by state on how they want to cover workers' COVID-19 claims, some of them are saying that, well, we're going to make sure that they're all eligible for workers' compensation. Others are saying, well, if they happen to an essential worker, then we'll do that. But the presumption laws are shifting claims onto workers' compensation carriers all across the board in every single state. And that's going to have a serious impact. And frankly, we don't actually know what that'll mean, because as the system is flooded with these claims, as they're investigated, depending on what states do, that is going to have probably to some carriers going belly up. And you're already seeing calls as well from the carriers. They're asking for the same kind of risk corridor subsidies that health insurance carriers are asking for. We had asked the question on a previous webinar about whether, as an employer, assuming that an employee contracts COVID-19 and it's not yet clear whether the claim qualifies for workers' compensation, they asked us, well, what would we rather have? Would we rather have the claim handled under health insurance or under the workers' compensation? And one note we made at the time was, at least with workers' compensation, the amount that providers are reimbursed is already set. It's capped, right? So, whereas if you're dealing with a health plan and there's an unknown amount of testing or treatment, the exposure for the health plan can be a lot more. So in theory, for a self-funded employer, it'd be better if your claims are filtered through workers' compensation. Of course, understanding that that could lead to a higher premium and that coverage the next year, but it's probably still better than the healthcare system as it stands today. So I think on the whole, the key here will be that as these claims come in, as different states are flooded at different levels with workers' compensation claims, it's going to have an impact on your bottom line, no matter how you slice it and how you dice it. And there's other considerations to look at as well. And for some of those, including subrogation, I hand it over to Ron for the next slide.
Hey, really quick, it's Adam. I want to make sure I bring something up here. Your coordination of benefits process at a TPA needs to be, probably re-examined to make sure that you're not paying claims or at least subrogating those particular claims, whether it's with us or anyone else. So just be really mindful of the fact that a lot of these claims could be related to workers' compensation now that otherwise you weren't even thinking of. So, Ron?
That's right. One other thing that we need to consider as well, some of these plans that we service, these employers that self-fund their health benefit plan, also self-fund their workers' compensation. And so the analogy we like to use is that it's one pair of pants with two different pockets, and which one you reach into, ultimately it comes out of the same bank account. And so to Brady's point, with workers' comp, if they have a statutory limit on what they need to pay, sort of a fee schedule, it makes a lot of sense to look at workers' compensation as that option. But to Adam's point, when you look at things like coordinating benefits and subrogation, as with subrogation for the generations, so too here, you need to make a decision, right? Which is that pay and chase methodology, where you're going to basically pay the claims and then look for an alternative payer to reimburse you when and if they're identified and proved to be primarily responsible. Or the coordination of benefits approach, where you identify that there's potentially another payer, you sort of hold off payment until that's confirmed, yay or nay, and then proceed accordingly. And there are pros and cons to both approaches. When you're talking about coordination of benefits, obviously the benefits are obvious. You're holding on to the money, but one of the downsides is you may lose out on things like discounts, and there's prompt pay rules, and that all dictate how quickly you need to pay. So how you choose to approach is going to depend on a lot of different factors, way too many to talk about here. Take note of two things before we move to the next slide. Number one, the Phia Group is tracking all the different rules at the federal and state level regarding who's responsible for what and when. And two, how to approach it depends a lot on the language, the contractual obligations, the providers, the area where you find yourselves, your subrogation provisions. So for all of that to determine what the best approach is for a given plan, be sure to contact us and we'll walk through it with you. And speaking of people that need to be walked through, let's turn it back over to Brady.
Hey, before Brady talks, I want to make sure I bring up a couple points. I want to give kudos to him. You guys know I never do that. but he's done a great job working with our internal Phia
Wow.
task force to coordinate all the events around this pandemic and what we are doing for our company internally. So he's gonna spend a couple minutes here just talking about some of our policies and practices that we would love to share with all of you as well. So take it away, Brady.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, it's really a testament to how good our team was internally that our plan, which is very comprehensive, when the state of Massachusetts released its plan and its best practices, I said to our team, I think our plan's more robust and probably we should have given it to the state because really it's got more things covered. But as you think about reopening your office and returning people back to the workplace, of course, you have to listen to what your individual state is saying. And I think, like Adam said, we're the last state to open up, but everyone is pretty much opening in phases. And you most likely have posted on your state website, what are the requirements for you to open as an office? What if you're, in a different industry, if you're in a high risk industry? And so what we did was we put together a task force to both monitor the federal and state guidance, but also create our own best practices based on what was already out there. And we looked at covering sort of all the bases here. And what we did is we came up with self-certification forms for our employees. We're using a temperature check system to make sure that we're screening people, make sure that they're safe and they're sent home if they have a fever or signs of it. You've got a face mask requirement, very comprehensive. We're doing an extensive training process for our employees once they return. We're implementing different restrictions in our office and protections, which you should think about doing as well, depending on how crowded your workspaces are. Are you customer facing? These are all questions you've got to consider. You've got to put up a ton of signage all around the workplace. Some of that signage is required depending on the state you're in. Some of it's going to be just as friendly reminders for your staff. You've got to have social distancing guidelines. That means you've got to go through your building inch by inch and remove, chairs, furniture, move tables around, things like that. You've got to make sure that you're providing supplies, a lot of supplies, and performing frequent cleaning. These are all things meant to reduce your liability in the event that there is an outbreak. And if, in case there is, on the next slide, you'll see that we have some particular policies that we put in place to try and prevent an outbreak. Because at the end of the day, the goal here is slowing the spread. That's always been said from the top. It's true now that you can't prevent any outbreak and all outbreaks, but you can slow the spread. You can, I think it's called safer at home now. So things like encouraging work from home if you can, important to do. Encouraging high-risk employees to work from home.
Brady,
very
one
important
thing
to do.
here.
Sure.
I want to just put an emphasis on, folks. The key thing here, as you can read these, are the policies putting in place, the actual wording in regards to the limitations of travel. If they do return to work, if your employees return to work, having them sign off on a checklist. The details specifically as it relates to the confidentiality of medical information. If there's ever a time where you could have a HIPAA violation, this is it. No question about it. How you manage all that. So the wording, the actual documents, the policies, these are all things we took a lot of pride in putting that together, where I think we're way ahead of what the rest of the industry is doing. And that's really what I want to make sure we emphasize here, Brady.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Adam said, to his point, each one of these policies represents a 3 or 4 page document that we've written up here to make sure that everything's clearly identified, specified. You got to make sure that you're not engaging in discrimination against people that may have an existing condition or maybe over a certain age. You can only encourage them to work from home, but there's a way you do that by being both careful and prudent, frankly, in how you do it. And then limiting business travel as much as you can. That's important as well, as a way to just make sure that you're keeping your population as safe as you can. A good way to organize all these policies, like we said before, is through the use of some kind of a checklist where you can have people, sign off on, I've done these things, it's safe to come back. Like I said before, though, every state has different requirements. Look and see what your state's requirements are. If you need help understanding what they mean, or you want to look at some samples that we may have, reach out to us. We put a lot of work into this, and we're looking forward to reopening a safe office in the near future. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Adam.
Perfect. Well, folks, that's all the time we have for today. Looking forward to having all of you join us on our next free webinar, June 16th, my sister's birthday, 1 o'clock Eastern time. We're hoping for a day where we don't have to talk about COVID anymore. I'm actually hoping for the day where I don't have to do this webinar from my basement as well. Maybe June 16th will be that day. We'll see. But on behalf of Jen McCormick, Brady Bizzaro, Ron Peck, and myself, thank you for the thousands of you who've dialed in and listened in. We appreciate you all. We love you all. We hope you all stay safe. Have a great rest of your day, great weekend. See you next month. Thank you.